Orin Martin here with a former student, friend, colleague, you could say partner in crime. Why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Teresa Kurtek. I'm one of the 3 owners of Fifth Crow Farm and former apprentice and student of Orin's.
All right, enough with the preliminary. So we're here today standing in front of a block of high dollar value perennial flowers. A few rows of roses and an amazing row of just starting to come into bloom second, third year peonies. So maybe have Teresa talk a little bit about the elements that she put together to bring these plantings online and how it is additive to an already existing cut flower block, mostly composed of annuals.
Sort of our general approach with the roses, which has been that we have a lot going on at this farm. We grow a huge amount of stuff.
What's the total acreage?
I think that we're probably close to 80 acres.
Yeah, so
productive
given the
acres.
enormity of your operation,
Given the complexity and enormity of the operation, when we took on the roses, I made a very conscious decision, the same with our orchards, that we needed to find roses that would produce with little input. So rather than, we haven't coddled them. Like if we see disease stuff, you can just get into this cycle of trying to address a little problem. And really maybe it's just the wrong variety for the job kind of thing. So we've more like pruned out the ones that haven't been successful, replaced them, focused on the stuff that needs less input. And rather than panic and start spraying 3 times a day to save the roses, we've more just been like, okay, they're not harvestable right now, you know? And we need to be able to do it with minimal input for it to be profitable. We don't try to compete with the nurseries that are growing stuff indoors. So we've tried to pick things that you don't see as much in grocery store bouquets. And there's heaps of roses on the market, but not very many roses that have scent. So we wanted to see and give it a go with organic roses, since there aren't really any on the market, and a lot of the roses that you see are, hybrid tea roses, don't really have any scent. So we picked varieties that were either floribundas or were like double petaled, more antique looking, and all of them had to have a certain amount of disease resistance and had to have scent. Those were kind of our
2
qualifications.
Good operatives,
So,
yes,
yeah.
definitely.
And we largely don't include them in bouquets. So our bouquets, with our bouquet making, we have a strict rule for numbers of stems per bouquet, even when stems are flimsy and tiny, because of it costs the same amount to harvest something that's tiny as it does to harvest something that's big. So we try to make sure in our bouquets that we're not giving people stuff that they're, that everything has to count basically in the bouquets, and we can get a lot more for the roses by selling them in single bunches. So in general, most of the roses are going in single bunches. We tried doing single bunch varieties, and we've actually found that it does better for us to just mix colors. So we do 5 to 6 stems per bunch and sell them at $10 currently, $10 a bunch. And if there's excess, the short ones, there are a lot of short ones when you're not growing all hybrid teas. Right. And those we actually dry and use in our dried floral wreaths cool. and floral arrangements. Mm. And then anything that comes back for the market gets dried. And occasionally when we have a lot of something, they'll go in bouquets, but then we reduce the stem count in the bouquets to kind of compensate. So.
And then maybe you can just kind of talk through your annual inputs, what you do when with the roses here as far as management?
Sure. So we, trying to think, initially we planted everything in gopher baskets because they're a big investment. And we actually found, we spent a lot of money on more expensive gopher baskets because we really wanted our roses not to get eaten by gophers. And we found that it restricted the roots too much, and they did very poorly. So we ended up digging them all up after year 2 and removing the gopher baskets, which is risky because sometimes you lose them to gophers. And we also, so we ended up, this particular site, on the other site we didn't worry about it as much. It had sandier soil. But it turns out the roses really didn't perform well in that sandy soil. I think it just didn't hold on to enough nutrients. They did not like it, even though it's warmer over there. So we moved them to this site. This site has a clay loam soil and isn't very well drained. So they're on pretty raised beds. We used our strawberry bed shaper. I don't know if you can kind of see, but these are pretty tall beds. And then we landscape fabricked, and we have one piece of landscape fabric that goes across the path and up the side of the rows. And then once a year, we pull it back to each side, and we do a compost application just one time a year. But we did a heavy compost application initially as well. So we do one compost application and a little fertilizer in the spring. And that's pretty much it. They're low maintenance in terms of inputs. We'll agro-thrive them every now and again, which it's something that we inject in the lines, but it's not a fertilizer per se. It's like a it's a bunch of active bacteria to help.
Yeah, it's kind of like a little gentle nudge moving forward.
A gentle nudge.
And it does have nutrients too, but
if we feed too heavily, we just end up with a lot of aphids.
yeah.
They respond a lot to fertilizer.
And aphids respond to succulent nitrogenous growth, yes, that's
but they're
true.
very deeply rooted plants, and if you have a relatively... The roses that are in my garden around my house are much more disease-free, and I do nothing. I water them every 3 weeks, if I remember, and they seem to do better than the ones that I micromanage out in the field. So I'm trying to back off a little bit more this year. Once we start seeing, if we start seeing mildew and we start seeing disease stuff, then we usually we get on a weekly spray regime where we'll alternate spraying like neem for pests and thrips and stuff, and then the next week we spray millstop to try to cut down on the mildew stuff. Thus far this year we haven't sprayed anything.
And actually, in light of the spring weather we've had, or more precisely haven't had, these are incredibly clean and disease resistant. Yeah, there's a little spot of this and that here and there. And overall, I would say, given your management strategy, hey, well done. These are vigorous bushes, really just reaching their peak here.
While there are a couple heavy hitters, we've experimented with a lot of different varieties. So we've had a lot die on us, and then we've tried other things. And I think that every microclimate is a little different, because I'd call the rep and ask them what they thought would be the best performing, and I read all the reviews, and that doesn't always match up to your particular, like what your soil type is, what your winter climate is like. I wait in the spring until I see some like major signs of growth before I prune. I leave them the whole winter, and I don't prune. And we found that because roses in our climate, it's so mild that they'll tend to keep putting up buds even into December. Like you'll still see a few roses, and when there's almost nothing else in the field, it's very tempting to pick them. But what we found is they grow so poorly. There's not much growth, like vegetative growth happening. So I think what we were doing, sort of like with the peonies, they need that vegetative growth to make it through the winter. It's all the sugars and starches that are being pulled into the roots that are gonna help your spring production. So one of the things the last 2 years, we've really backed off. We set ourselves a timeline, and we say, okay, mid-October, we got to stop. Even if they look good, even if the weather's nice, even if the frost hasn't hit them, we don't pick. We just let them go, let them do their thing, and then we don't touch them until we start seeing growth in the spring, because when we've pruned too early, it seems to have really hit them back. It's like set them back somehow.
Well, you're cutting so much, you're taking so much off the plant during the growing season. You have to maybe back off and be a little more conservative with how much you take off with your winter pruning.
Yeah. One thing that we found, some of the roses that have the best scent also drop their petals instantaneously. So there's sort of this tricky balance between wanting to give, the idea was to find roses that would give people the experience of being in their own rose garden, you know what I mean? You like stick your face in the rose and it smells so good. And some of those roses at the state that they appeal to the customer. So they don't have that much of a scent when they're in a tight bud, right? They have scent when they're open and being pollinated, but they drop their petals within a day of that.
Yeah.
So the pictures, like I've noticed with a lot, like Floret does a lot of this, they have these beautiful pictures of all these open flowers, but if you pick at that stage, there's no vase life, right? And there's this tricky, like with, when you take stuff to a farmer's market, we can bring it more open. That's more appealing to the customer. So if we pick in tight bud, they don't sell as well at market. But if we pick them more open, they don't have very much vase life. So you kind of have to, people seem to so enjoy the scent that the fact that there's a shorter vase life seems like largely we sell out, but we have to pick completely differently for our wholesale accounts than we do for the, so
makes sense.
When we initially started harvesting, our like florist accounts and our little grocery store accounts sent them back because they said they're too open, they're blown, they're too open, and we had to pick them in very, very tight bud. And it is hard to balance because you're getting a lot more money if you sell them just straight in these bunches, right? Than if you are trying to put them in bouquets. That's kind of a waste, but there's this challenge in balancing how to pick, how heavily to pick. Figuring out how heavily to harvest, because in your own garden, when you're growing roses just for the pleasure of having roses in your garden, we tend to, we pick much less aggressively. And for production, you want as many blooms as you can. And a lot of roses, even if they say they're not repeat bloomers, will bloom. You have to cut them heavy to get them to bloom. But what happens, I think, is then you hit them so hard that they become, there's a balance if you want them to grow big and be vigorous for many years versus maximize the production, and maybe in 3 to 5 years you're going to replace a bunch of them because you've basically worn them out by just, because if you pick heavy, they will grow, they will keep growing, but then it has its negatives.
Short term, long term.
Yeah, trying to figure out how hard to go. So we were just talking about how we run sales and keep our sales organized. I think it might have been even in year 4. So I think we've been using an online sales platform for at least 12 years, 10 or 12 years, and it made a huge difference. It's definitely well worth the money to pay to have a system for organizing and generating invoices automatically. There's just so many advantages that I think it's a no-brainer. It really is worth the money. So each week, so we have 2 fulfillment periods. We're using, we've tried 3 different platforms, and we've settled on Local Food Marketplace, which also has a new app called Connect, and I highly recommend. I'm really happy with how the platform works. And so I have 2 fulfillment periods. We fulfill orders on midweek. Wednesdays and Thursdays are when those orders are going out, and then also on the weekends. Most of it's going out Saturdays and a few things on Sunday. And for each of those, then I have a period during which people can order. So on Saturdays, I either walk the fields or I check in with my managers and we update the availability list. And then the availability list is open and people can order. The platform, it's just like an online store. And when people order, those orders are automatically generate an invoice. That was one of the inefficiencies before, was that you could collect the order, then you have to type up the invoice and print out the invoice. And this is all automatic. All the data, like when they place that order, boom, you've got a record of the sale. You have a record that can be translated into harvest record, records of production later for your organic certifier. You have an automatically generated invoice from that, and I can generate a harvest list from that as well. So we have an open period Saturday through Tuesday, 5:30 a.m. People can order. 5:30 a.m. it cuts off, and then I tally up all my orders because we're also dealing with CSA, and we're dealing with restaurants and grocery stores and markets, so I tally all that stuff up. And then we harvest on Tuesdays and are finishing everything up, Wednesday mornings. Then everything goes out to be delivered Wednesday or Thursday. As soon as those invoices are printed, I'm back to evaluating what we have left. And I walk the fields again, check in with people that have been harvesting, and I update the availability list again. Then Wednesday to Friday morning, people have an opportunity to order for the weekends. And what else do I want to add to that? Yeah, well worth the money to have a platform that's doing that, and forcing your customers to conform to it. It can be painful initially when certain people have a hard time getting their orders in on time, but chasing the small order that comes in after you've already sent everybody out into the field to pick, in our experience, is just never worth it. You end up doing way more work, and it's good to kind of prune off the customers that can't figure out how to work with your timing and your schedule, and you will eventually find the people for whom it works, and there's a more symbiotic relationship. So.